We want to go over one of the topics from our winner for the 80,000 YouTube subscriber contest, and that would be Sarah Ryals. And her question was asking about a more in-depth information video on wet sanding and paint correction. So what I would like to do is give you my personal perspective from my experiences in the industry of also running and operating my own shop on wet sanding, when to and when not to, and then of course what follows up to that is the paint correction side and what all involved there in regards to defect removal and how to follow up with wet sanding as well. Now, there's a lot of different approaches and there's a lot of great trainers in the market that touch on this topic. Those trainers have their way of doing things as well, which there's nothing wrong. It's just a different approach, right? It's just like going to a different university, having a different professor, and of course, covering the same subject. It's just different perspective, right? Now, on factory clear coat, you know, some of the things about factory clear coat is we know that clear coat itself is as thin, if not thinner, than a piece of sticky note paper. So on average, most of that is going to be right around 1.5 mils to 2 mils thickness. And the same thing with the base coat, right around 1.5 mils, 2 mils thickness. And then you have your primer coat. So on average, you're right around that, I would say 4 to 5 mil thickness. Now, of course, when you do read with a paint gauge, which you should, of course, first and foremost, read your paint with a paint gauge like what you see here with the Speedmaster paint gauge. You're gonna wanna get your reading to understand what you're working with, how much meat is on the bone to say. And that's gonna allow you to understand how much sanding can be done. Now again, going into a factory clear coat, you're dealing with so much thinness these days that we are experiencing as professionals where you gotta be super careful. So for that, you're gonna wanna make sure that you're using something that's mildly abrasive if you do have to get into heavy defect removal. And that could be from, you know, maybe at the factory they did some denibbing because there was some dirt in the paint and they didn't finish out completely, or there was a scratch in the paint that isn't too deep but just deep enough to where you can level it out with your sanding. And of course, that's what sanding is for, to expedite your leveling process versus compounding with a buffer of some sort. So when it comes to the type of sandpaper you're gonna wanna use on factory clear coat, with it being so thin, you're gonna only wanna use somewhere between the 2,000 to 3,000 range on average. I mean, that doesn't 100% mean you have to stay within that realm, but that's gonna give you the safe spectrum to where you won't have to worry so much about blowing through the clear coat to say. Whether you do it by hand or you do it by machine, that's also gonna be another question we get asked often. Now, I do know personally by machine, it will be a bit less aggressive going that and a bit more uniform than going by hand, because obviously by hand you're going directional. So in some cases, if you're not careful, you'll end up fighting some linear lines or cross-hatching lines, as to where with machine sanding, you know, the downside of that is the pigtails if you're not cleaning the actual sanding paper pad. So you do have some pros and cons on which choice you want to go, but the least aggressive route would be machine sanding versus hand sanding. And again, some people, you know, that have more experience may lean towards one area versus another. Some people may like hand sanding because they are super experienced in that category. But for some of those that are novice or just getting into it, I would say if you're gonna take a least aggressive route, I would go into machine sanding. And that's where the Mirka Abalone sanding discs are gonna be super helpful for that, because they do have a foam interface. So that does help in regards to giving you some cushion or some buffer room in between the actual machine and the sandpaper to the paint surface itself. They have in increments of 1,000, 2,000, 3,000, and 4,000. So that will allow you to accommodate for all your sanding needs when it comes to machine sanding. And of course, they make the 6-inch disc and the 3-inch disc for that. And then of course, if you get into hand sanding, you can still use those discs with sanding blocks, or of course, just go with traditional sandpaper as well. Of course, automotive sandpaper, whether it be wet sanding or dry sanding. And not to get too far down the rabbit hole, there are two different approaches to that when I mention wet sanding and or dry sanding. But I want to stay more on the topic of how to approach that with sanding in general. So that's the safe area when it comes to OEM factory clear coat. Now, if you have a custom vehicle that has been resprayed, repainted, now you know that you're gonna have a lot more meat on the bone most of the time. If you know the painter and you know the process, then that will give you the insight on exactly where they started and where they finished with how much base coat and clear coat they use. And of course, you're gonna wanna measure it, of course, just to back that up. But that's where when you get into classic cars, older cars, or even some newer cars that get resprayed, you have a bigger advantage to get a bit more heavier handed, or even get down into like the 1,000 or 1,500 range, or even below that, which I've seen people in the market, detailers, body shops, get more into a heavier grit because they know how much they're working with when it comes to how much clear coat's on the surface. But I can tell you to definitely be aware of how much clear coat you have on that surface before you decide to sand. Personally, at my shop, we do very light sanding with 2,000 or 3,000 for defect removal, and then that's it. And then we move forward with just heavy compounding. And that's where the other side of it, when it comes to paint correction, it can be more beneficial and less liability versus sanding, because at that point, when I look at it in regards to a vehicle or a customer's personal belongings, such as this newer C8, that's where I look at it as, okay, as a professional detailer, I'm in here to improve and then enhance and of course protect. But with that, I don't want to take away clear coat that is going to compromise the thickness of the paint system, because there's only so much that you could remove before you start to compromise the actual thickness of the paint system. And let's just say it's 1.5 to 2 mils. Well, when clear coat cures, the UV inhibitors that are in the clear coat, which is what we're preserving with traditional waxes, paint sealant, ceramic coatings, whatever protection, that's what we're doing. We're helping preserve the cosmetic value and some of those UV inhibitors that are in the actual clear coat. Well, as you chop away at that surface and level out for defects, you're starting to remove those. And that could essentially, if you get too thin, compromise the clear coat system and cause premature failure. So for that reason, that's where you want to sometimes just more or less improve on defect removal versus remove. That way you don't compromise the clear coat system and actually have to force the customer to a body shop later down the road. Now, you could be a hero and a purist and remove the defect and make the customer happy, but what about later down the road? What if they get a defect in that designated area once more? Then you have no room for what I call repair value. And that's being able to revisit that area and that surface to do another repair to cosmetically improve and or enhance it. Because once you level out that clear coat to where it's too thin, you can't do nothing. But if you just improve and not remove, that will allow you to revisit and actually do something again for the customer once again to make them happy. And that will help preserve the paint system overall. So that's where you got to understand, are you going to need to sand on a vehicle? How in depth do you need to get to sand? And of course, what are you working with? Are you working with OEM paint from the factory, or are you working with aftermarket respray? You know, you got to weigh these things out. Either way, one of the most important things is of course going to be measuring that paint. You're going to measure the paint, and then you're going to move forward to figure out, you know, how aggressive you need to get in regards to the defect removal, because you are shaving and leveling out a lot of that clear coat immediately when it comes to sanding versus compounding. Now, of course, with the compounding, you are introducing a little bit of heat, and of course, the mild abrasive from the liquid, and of course the pad with it being abrasive as well, such as a wool pad or a foam pad. Obviously the wool pad being a lot more aggressive in your correction approach. However, these are things that you have to think about, and you have to be well calculated moving forward in regards to the service at hand, whether you're a DIY just on your own vehicle so you don't harm anything, or if you're a paid professional with somebody bringing you their personal belonging that they've invested a lot of money into for you, of course, to enhance and protect the vehicle. Now, there's a whole lineup of things that you could do within the services mentioned. You know, you could spend a whole couple days to a week on training for wet sanding. There's a lot of great guys out there that can train you on wet sanding. And then of course with paint correction as well, you know, you could spend a day, a couple days a week. There's a lot that goes into the variables of all those different subjects. But at least today we wanted to cover kind of the ins and outs and the basics of, you know, what to do and what not to do and how to approach that, and think about it before you move forward, whether you're wet sanding or paint correction, and realistically why and how you would want to move forward with either of those options. So hopefully this was helpful. Sarah, again, congratulations. And anybody else who has watched this, if there's anything else, any questions you have, please visit us, comment, like, share, of course, autogeek.com.